Welcome to the Cosmic Connection. This is your place to explore the beauty and order of the cosmos.
And your connection to it all.
My name is Amanda Walsh, and I'm the founder of Astrology Hub.
And I'm Rick Merlin Levine, your cosmic navigator.
Now let's dive in.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Cosmic Connection. It's so great to be here with you all and to be here with our cosmic navigator, Rick Merlin Levine. And today we're going to be talking about when astrology becomes an obsession and really exploring this line between like a healthy engagement with astrology as a tool, and then that line for when it becomes it's using you. Like you're no longer using it, it's using you. And so it's out of balance. And I was just telling Rick that I recently met someone who said, you know, I was so into astrology for 10 years. You know, every person I met, I would run their chart. I was in the horoscopes every day. I was looking at everything. And then she got to a point where she's like, and then I had to completely denounce it and just like completely walk away from it because it wasn't healthy anymore. So I was thinking about this and I was thinking, God, I wonder what Rick would say about this. And so here we are having this conversation. And Rick, where do you want to start with this?
Just that I've had a 55-year unregulated obsession. That I actually, just to get this off to a right start, in my mid 30s, I mean, I kind of fell into astrology in my late teens, and by my early 20s, everything in my life in some way had to be fit around my astrology obsession, where I was really mostly at that time in learning mode. But after I began seeing clients doing charts, even I moved to Southern California, and between just needing to cope with life and have family and whatever, I began questioning, maybe I'm so clever that I could just make all this shit work. And maybe it's not really based on reality. You know, I mean, I have a scientific, logical background. And, what if I'm just really like everyone else, just getting sucked into this and making it all up? And I ended up putting all of my astrology books, computer programs, calculation software, ephemerises in boxes in a garage where they stayed for nearly 2 years. I did no astrology. None.
Wow.
And I think I've told bits of this story before online. And that is during a time when many years prior, I assumed would be like an amazing opening experience in my life. I have a handful of planets in mid-Aries trine Pluto in mid-Leo, and I have mid-Sagittarius descendant, which means that if you use that descendant point, I have a grand fire trine with 5 planets and the descendant. And when Uranus was moving through Sagittarius, I knew it was going to hit my descendant and complete a grand trine. And I'm a Uranian kind of guy. And I thought, wow, this is going to be the greatest time in my life. And I had a roller skating accident that basically debilitated me. And I mean, I lost use of my right arm, right hand. It went on for months. I was on disability. I couldn't use my right hand, so I couldn't shave. I couldn't brush my teeth. I'm a real right-handed, left-brained, or was until then person. Couldn't eat soup. Couldn't zip up my pants. I mean, it was really awful. And it was like, at first it was like, oh, no big deal. It's an accident. I'll just deal with it. But it lingered. And it lingered. And during that period of time, I began taking those boxes out of the garage. I had time. I wasn't going to work fighting LA traffic every day and dealing with running an operation where I had 25 people responsible to me and blah, 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 blah. And I started opening up boxes of my music and poetry and astrology and stuff. And to this day, the leftover from that accident is my right hand. This knuckle, when I make a fist, that knuckle doesn't move because it was basically lost in that. I don't know if I can't twist it around in a way to see it, but this knuckle is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my physical reminder that I cannot take that stuff and put it away forever. Because it took that Uranian lightning strike of an accident or event, which was life-shattering at that time, that actually it was almost like the cosmos was saying, you're no longer in control of your life. You've got yourself into this kind of straitjacket, corporate existence. And if you're not paying attention to what you really need to do, we're gonna make it happen for you. And now, having said that, the point is that I understand the obsession with astrology, and I would like to say that I have a healthy balance between it and the rest of my life. And compared to some people, I probably do, and yet it's everything in my life. Although I should also say that, unlike many astrologers, I how do I want to say this? I've a friend that I've known for 30 years, who, when we first met, and in the discussion in a group was, "Oh, Rick's an astrologer," and everybody said their birth date, and then I said to this guy, Fred, "So what's your birth date?" And he goes, "I don't share that with anyone." And he's been a friend of mine for 30 years, and I've never asked him again, and he's never volunteered, and I don't care. It doesn't impact the relationship that I have with him. And this is my kind of saving grace with astrology, is that as much as I think it's an amazing tool, it's not a required tool to live life, but it certainly can help one manage it better. And I think that the idea of people becoming obsessed with astrology is, people become obsessed with Shoshuran Buddhism, chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. They become obsessed with Scientology. They become obsessed with Jesus Christ. They become obsessed with anti this and pro that. We're humans. When we stumble on something that is either really eye-opening and attractive in whatever way it is, whether it's an idea or a person that we meet, or we become totally obsessed in avoiding something, whether it's an idea or a person we meet or a person that represents some idea that we hate, we become obsessed. So I don't think astrology is any different there. It has different ramifications, though.
So let me make sure I understand the timeline. So you fell in love with astrology. It became everything in your life, and your whole life was around it. And then why did you say, okay, I'm going to put everything in the boxes and put everything away? And in those 2 years, is that when you sort of like got a little bit off track and did the whole corporate thing? And then you had
I was already doing the corporate thing a bit, but I was in some way kind of having somewhat of a balance.
Okay.
And I was able to do the corporate thing and yet still, do enough astrology that it was satisfying.
Yeah.
And at some point in time, living in Los Angeles, with, family and, house and, and car in garage, cars and whatever, it was like, it just became harder to find time to even just keep your life together. But on top of that, I really, for years, had gradually, questioned, not that astrology works, but why it works, how does it work, and maybe it doesn't work, and maybe we're just making all this up. And maybe even if we're not making it all up, maybe it's just a curious distraction. And, and it just basically, it was almost like no time for this. I got to grow up. I got to get real. And it just got gradually, it wasn't like one day. I'll tell you a story about someone who many people might know through his books. He passed away about, I don't know, maybe about 15 years ago or so. An astrologer who I'm privileged to say was a good friend of mine, a guy named Robert Blaschke, who wrote a number of really excellent books. And his legacy is enshrined by the number of recordings, at that time audio rather than video recordings. And Robert was a very intense character, and very, very one of the smartest, most incisive astrologers, incisive thinking astrologers that I'd ever met. And Robert was brought up Catholic. And at 2 times in his life, he actually got it that astrology was satanic, and put on fire, burned all of his astrology books, and said, this is satanic work of the devil, and I'm not doing this, and I can't, and it's against everything, and blah. And 2 times he did that, and 3 times he brought that material back into his life and acknowledged his obsession, which we're all thankful for.
Wow. And it's interesting. The person that I met who was explaining to me that they were really into astrology for 10 years, and then they got, I'm guessing the person's really Christian. She said she got a message that she needs to commune directly with God, that astrology was creating sort of like a overlay between her and God, and that direct connection.
Oh, you mean like the church does with priests?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. However, I don't think she was saying, and so I need to go through priests instead. I think she was getting the encouragement that like there needs to be more of a direct line. But what was interesting for me is it was kind of like, well, but it still is a direct line, because I don't know.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
One of the most interesting books that Buckminster Fuller wrote was a collection of his poems and essays, and the lead piece in that book was a kind of an essay poem called "No More Secondhand God." I mean, the concept is very brilliant, but unlike a lot of other systems of thought, astrology in its purest sense is not a secondhand God. It is basically a way for us to engage with what's considered to be the divine proportion, those realms which you got to understand that until the 17th century, until Johannes Kepler came along, it was considered that humans were on the earth and everything in the heavens was divine, was not within human realms. And although we credit Kepler with coming up with the 3 laws of planetary motion, and he did, and of course he did that because as an astrologer he needed to know where the planets were, but modern science just says he was the father of modern astronomy and did that breakthrough math. But the real fact behind it is that he was the first human who actually created a way for human thought, rationalization, mechanics to explain or to work with those things that were previously divine, godlike. And so we may be a little bit off track with the obsession, but the fact of the matter is that as astrologers, we are simply engaging in what's in the Lord's Prayer. And it amazes me that how many people recite the Lord's Prayer even daily and yet don't believe what's in it, because they say it is done on earth as it is in heaven. And that's all astrology is is it's done on earth as it is in heaven. And if you consider God to be in the divine proportion or in the heavens, well, then astrology is one way, not the only way of interacting directly with that energy, that concept, that idea.
Okay, question for you. In your decades of being engaged with astrology, do you see it go into what you would consider unhealthy territory in terms of like it ruling people's lives to a point where it's paralyzing or it's somehow unhealthy? And if so, what have you seen sort of inclines people towards that, like crossing that line from it?
Okay.
Yeah.
First of all, just a clarification. You said in your years of astrology, have you seen it cross that line? It doesn't cross that line.
Right.
We
Right.
cross that line. So
Absolutely.
it's not the body of information. And that's really all astrology is a body of information. Now, people, I think that the bumper sticker, that said, I love Jesus Christ. It's his followers that scare the hell out of me. It's like we can take a good teaching, we can take a concept, and as humans, we, through our obsessions, through our desires, through our fears, we can turn it into something that it really isn't. And yes, people do that with astrology on all sides of, I guess I was going to say on all sides of the spectrum. I think a spectrum can only have two sides, but you know what I mean. In many, many, many different ways, we humans use astrology to do irrelevant or negative stuff. And in fact, going back to Johannes Kepler, who wrote a book called Tertium Inter Venus, Latin for between, it's kind of like the third man in the middle. And he was saying that we are, at his time, in the middle between a modern science based upon rationalism and an ancient superstition based upon, or an ancient system, astrology based upon superstition. And it was in this book, his third man in the middle, that he cautioned scientists in their haste for understanding and untangling the laws of the universe when it came to the superstitions and blasphemies. This is Kepler's words. When it came to the superstitions and blasphemies that were contained in the ancient system of astrology, not to, quote, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, end quote. That's a Keplerism, basically saying that there was a lot of good in astrology too. But he was so annoyed, and he wrote about how awful it was that the royalty used astrology to know when to go to war and whether or not they were going to get laid. It was like no different than today that Kepler was. It was like people actually, that's what made astrology popular. And this is kind of like an obsession that people who are attracted to astrology often think that it has all the answers. It will take the mystery out of life, and it will tell them if they should do this or not, or when they should do this or not. And that then becomes a very unhealthy obsession, but it's really only one of the unhealthy obsessions that I think astrology stirs up in people. People have so many questions, and there's so much unanswered about the mysteries of life, that because astrology seems to have some inklings of an answer here or there, all of a sudden it has all the answers. And I know that Amanda, about my astrology work, is that when people call up or now send emails and saying that, like a reading because they have a question, my response is always, no, I think you've reached the wrong astrologer. It seems like you're looking for the answer astrologer, and I'm the question astrologer. And it's not because of bad astrology. In fact, it's because I give such good answers. And my answers, if I give you a good answer, is my answer. It's not your answer. And therefore, it stops your questioning process, which is what creates your reality. And I'm not going to do that to you. I wouldn't do that even to someone I loved. I'm not going to answer their question, because even if it's a good answer, it's not your answer. And so from that standpoint, this is, I think, one of the worst dangers that astrology has for people, is that it takes the responsibility away from them and puts it, oh, it's not me. I just act like that because I have Mars in the 8th house square, square Saturn. And that's why I do this evil stuff. And that's a horrible use of astrology. But you see, astrology isn't here to limit us to the choice, to what appears in the chart. Astrology is here to show us that there are 12 other ways, or 11 other ways, that any planet in any sign can operate. And this is where astrology as a yoga practice, and I don't mean yoga as sitting in postures or asanas, I mean yoga in the true sense, which is a Sanskrit word that comes from the yoke of an ox. And yoga, whether it's a physical, asana based yoga, or whether it's a jhana yoga, or a bhakti yoga of devotion, or a mental yoga, or a yoga of doing right things, yoga is simply a way of harnessing the power of the oxen that, unless it's channeled, just goes awry. And in our charts, we're humans. We take the course of least resistance. We go awry until we begin to learn some guidelines, which may be the 10 commandments. It may be some religious or spiritual teaching. It may be years of therapy. It may be an intense entheogenic or psychedelic experience that kapow shatters our thoughts and wakes us up in some way, and we go, oh my God, I see everything differently now. It can be astrology. I mean, there's things that basically can wake us up, but then the question is, what do we do with it? And so for me, one of the worst offenses that people make with astrology is looking at their chart and then being afraid of what's going to happen in a week or a month or in a decade, because that which we resist will persist. And so when we put negative energy into a transit, even if it's a difficult transit, like Saturn or Pluto coming across our natal moon or natal sun or ascendant, I'm not saying that these transits are necessarily pieces of cake. However, they are necessary developmental phases in which we can either fold our cards and walk away from the game, or we can use that to develop some sort of discipline and or methodology in our life to react, or not to react, but to respond to the events. Because again, people think that what's in our chart, there's some sort of, fate. And just because I have this in my chart, this is what will be. Well, you can't look at a chart and tell whether that chart is the chart of a Nobel Peace Prize winner or a serial killer. Now, you can make some assumptions, and sometimes those assumptions are true, but sometimes they're not, because you can look at the charts with the most horrifically complicated and or difficult, or in traditional astrology, debilitated planets. And yet there are people who take those specific energies, and that becomes the thorn, in their foot or in their side, that teaches them how to remove thorns from everyone else. So oftentimes it's the thing that is the source of the problem that becomes the greatest gift that we can have, if we don't just blindly react, if we actually respond with intention and learn how to maximize the use of our chart, which is really the higher use of astrology. Now, the thing with obsession, though, is really intriguing, because people become very obsessed. And I've seen this in people just learning about astrology and spending 3 years and wanting to learn everything about it, until they realize it doesn't have all the answers that they thought. Many of these people become really good astrologers, and many of them just go back to their day job of, accounting or whatever it might be. But astrology, it certainly is a viable tool to widen our perspective, but it doesn't give any answers. It only gives us perspective. And this is the difference between how do I want to say this without being too judgmental? All right, I'll be judgmental. This is the difference between a useful astrologer and one who probably does more harm than good. And that is whether or not you use astrology as an astrologer to build up your power as the astrologer, and or to use astrology as a tool to take power away from the individual and shift it to the cosmos, to their chart. Well, you're just like this because this is what the chart is. For every situation, there is there is an array of potential responses. To quote, or not to quote, but to take the idea that Rick Tarnas spends so much time talking about, and that is astrology is not specifically predictive. It's archetypally descriptive. And there's many ways in which a person can live their life with a natal Saturn conjunct the moon. For some people, it's so heavy and so intense, they never get out from under the thumb of Saturn. For other people, they end up becoming a tyrant and projecting that Saturnian energy on those they love, thinking that that is how they best use it. And for other people, they use that very same transit to basically deconstruct authoritarianism and to help everyone around them feel that sense of authority or power that's so easily taken away from us by the social systems. So there is an array of potential and possibility when it comes to how people react or integrate or assimilate or become obsessed by astrology, either by wanting to know everything about it or being obsessed by trying to destroy it. And there are many scientists and quote unquote hardcore academicians who are obsessed with making astrology look stupid, or exorcising the blight, the wart of astrology from the body of humanity.
That's another perspective. There's definitely people obsessed with astrology on the side of, yes, wanting to destroy it.
Exactly.
Wow.
So there's many ways to have an obsession, yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is that it's when we are no longer, it's like when we've given our power away to it. And like you said, we can do this with anything. We can give our power away to anything that
to our parents, to our church.
Yes, exactly.
To our political leaders. There's a good one, because the world today is complex in a way that's different than the way it was complex a few hundred years ago. It was complex a few hundred years ago because it was complex to get water that didn't kill you, and to get shelter and food through winter. That was complex. That's not part of our complexity. Instead of being a hunter-gatherer trying to survive by gathering food, we now live in an information jungle where technically our food and water are largely supplied. I know that's not the case for everyone, but in our culture, most of us have at least, even if we're scraping by, food and water. But we're overwhelmed by the information jungle that's basically lurking out there to steal our authority, to hijack our trajectory, to pollute our thinking process, to change our mind so that someone else can benefit by our inaction or our acquiescence of our own responsibility or power. It's a very different world than it once was, and therefore astrology serves a very different role. And also astrologers are practicing a very different set of tools than astrologers practiced 1,000 years ago or even 500 years ago.
Okay, and the other thing I'm hearing you say is that the role of the astrologer can also play into this sort of unhealthy dynamic when the astrologer is using the information or the tool itself to bolster their own power and authority, and you can't really take power away from someone, but you can definitely try to, right?
Oh, you can take power away from someone in many different ways.
Mm.
I don't agree with that statement. I'm not trying to be Aries Martian argumentative, but but being stopped by a policeman, the policeman takes power away from you immediately. I mean,
Right. Okay,
there's
yeah.
an engagement there,
Right.
and as an astrologer, I can take power away from a client by saying, I'm looking at your chart and I see that you have the moon at 20 degrees of Pisces, and I know that Saturn has just entered Pisces. So you need to prepare for a really difficult time ahead when Saturn comes up to your natal moon, and you may go through some real stressful situations. If your marriage isn't in good shape, you may get divorced. These are all things that you should be prepared for. I've just taken power away from that person, because when I'm an astrologer with a client, whether I know it or not, they are in an altered state of consciousness, just as if I'd hypnotized them and said, listen to everything that I say. What I say is true and you'll believe it. Why is that? Because when I'm speaking as an astrologer, the wonderful now deceased astrologer Zip Dobbins used to say that when an astrologer talks, the client doesn't hear the astrologer talking. The client hears the cosmos talking.
Hmm.
And so when I say something as an astrologer, the person might be distracted by looking at the flowers on the table, or by a twinge that they just had in their shoulder or whatever, but their unconscious hears everything. And the unconscious doesn't know about time. It just sits there and waits for little events to happen. And so basically, by pumping negativity toward a specific outcome that I may have seen in someone else with that particular transit, I'm basically creating a hook for the unconscious mind, almost like delivering a homeopathic remedy. It just takes very, very little energy to drive a circuit that's resonantly, tuned. And therefore, 2 years later, the person calls me up and says, you were right, I got divorced. My God, I should have seen that coming. Well, you did. You made it happen.
So, Rick, how this is it gets a little confusing. So
It is.
If the astrologer saw that in the chart, and it's usually a tense kind of aspect or event, how could the astrologer help someone prepare for that without suggesting that it's going to happen?
Well, one could frame it. One could frame it differently and put it into perspective. Two separate issues.
Okay.
Uh, Putting it into perspective is very important, because if the person's over, 30 some odd years and it's a Saturn transit, well, they had Saturn transit over their moon previously. And in fact, they've had the transit of Saturn squaring their moon and opposing their moon and squaring their moon again. And now it's conjoining it for the next time. And one can actually do the work, the shadow work, which is really making the unconscious or the invisible visible. And in effect, by going back and recreating the history of what has happened prior times, one can begin to see the repetitive behavior, not the synchronicity. Those are meaningful coincidences at the same moment, but the diachronicity, which is the meaningful connection through time, dia across or through time, diachronos through time. And by doing that, one then begins to see that there's other ways in which one can engage that energy so one doesn't just fall into the invisible patterning that has already been established. Now, this isn't just a telling the client, here's what you need to do, because often it can involve years of therapy or whatever type of self-developmental work. You see, astrology is not therapy. Astrology, I always like to tell people, I'm not a therapist, I'm a catalyst. You know, and yet what I can say about your upcoming Saturn transit to your natal moon, as long as we're on that one, I can say that Saturn is the planet of restriction. Saturn is the planet that stabilizes energy and that pulls energy in toward the center. And as humans, we like to often push energy outward, Jupiter and not Saturn. Oftentimes, when we feel Saturnian things in our life, like getting a speeding ticket, it's a Saturnian thing. We bumped into a limit and we got caught, and therefore reality pushed back. Now, some Saturnian things are really healthy. They're guardrails on a curve around a mountain pass that prevents us from going over the edge. But other Saturnian things may not be as healthy, like when the government interferes with your free choice over something that they shouldn't be messing with. That's still Saturn infringing on you. So when Saturn comes around onto you and passes over the point where your natal moon is, it's certainly a time when one might be more aware of one's restrictive environment. Now, knowing that in advance, rather than waiting until Saturn has you tied up in handcuffs in jail, getting a ticket, being punished for, because Saturn is karma. You know, it's the you get what you deserve. And so rather than waiting until the event happens when Saturn transits your moon, if it's 2 years off or a year and a half off, this is a good time to start thinking about what has Saturn told me every time in my life it's acted or interacted with my moon in the prior times, and what are the lessons I can learn out of this? What are the things that I haven't been in control of? Where in my life am I not paying attention? I'm working really hard and my job is going great, but I'm not paying any attention to my family and my kids. Well, when Saturn hits the moon, maybe then that's the lesson that I'm going to have to learn that'll be really difficult unless I start dealing with it ahead of time. So I think this is really the lesson with all transits, is that they are neither good nor bad. They feel bad while they're happening. I saw someone in the chat box that's going by, and I'm not really reading it as it goes by, but everyone has those events in their life where when they were going through it, they were convinced this is the worst damn thing that ever happened. This is awful. My life has fallen apart. This isn't working. I can't believe this is what's going on. And then 8 years later, they go, that's the best thing that ever happened to me, because if that didn't happen to me, I wouldn't be here. That's often what occurs. And so, just this whole idea of astrology being the obsession, the fear is that astrology is fated. Every astrology says this is the way it is. My chart is written in stone and I can't change it. No, you can't change it, but you can change how you work with it and how you respond to it, rather than just saying, I guess this is going to suck in my life always because I have this planet in this sign and this house square that planet. And I mean, that's just a total cop-out.
Okay, so you are admittedly obsessed with astrology and have been for decades. I think many of the people in the chat are also admittedly obsessed, and it doesn't seem it's almost, I always think of it as like that process of falling in love with someone or something, where you're kind of obsessed, like you're thinking about the person or the thing all the time. The thing I've noticed about astrology is it does feel like you can stay in love with it for the long term. Like,
you can do that. You can do that with the human too.
I know you can. And it seems like in astrology, it happens all the time. I think it seems to happen a lot, that people fall in love, they have that initial like obsession, they maybe take a step away for a period of time. And I was recently talking to Taylor Schuler, who she was talking about titrating and how you you go all in, and then you take a breath, you take a step back, and then you go back in. And it sounds like you did that, at least.
Well, and titration actually is less about going in and out than it is about finding the right speed of flow of the liquid. When something's
Right.
being titrated in the
Right.
lab, there's basically a right drip or flow. And here, what you're really talking about astrologically is the important balance between the cosmic regulators, which is Jupiter more, Saturn less. That's what, Jupiter is expansive, Saturn is contractive. And what happens is that when we become obsessed, what happens is that we're pushing up against the limit of Saturn and we're ignoring it. When we become obsessed, we basically have the titration system opened up wide so that the energy is just flowing full. And that is great, except we're not getting any other nutrients, and we're only getting the flow of what that is, which ultimately is to our detriment. So I would say that although sometimes the way that Jupiter Saturn regulates itself is that Saturn comes in with a stop. Okay, now start again and see if you can get it right. That's different than the let's see if I can find a healthy place to put this obsession that I have. I mean, in my life, I've been, obsessed, with deep psychology since before I even could quite figure out what it was. Reading Freud and Jung when I was too young to really understand it, but something was, and I'm still obsessed with that. Music. I mean, as a kid, I was blessed by the fact that I had intense musical training on a number of instruments. I've never wanted to be a performer, but again, as you and my students know, my love of music is really what drives my love of astrology. Astrology, in effect, my obsession with astrology is really a part of my obsession with music, which is basically the hum of the music of the spheres. And it's basically, there's something very mathematical, something very the sacred geometry of music. It's all there, but there's also something totally magical that the math and science doesn't touch. My point here is that I have a number of obsessions, not just astrology, but astrology seems to be in my life and in many people's lives, um, like the highest form of the combination of the other obsessions. And from that standpoint, I feel very blessed that I can wake up and think about astrology every day. However, there are times when I'm out in the woods or by the ocean or having just cleared my ears and my regulator is kicked in and I'm 40 feet below the surface of the water, with a scuba tank on my back, where I'm not thinking about astrology at all. So astrology is a great system, but it's a map. It's not reality. It's simply one way to map reality. Just like a map doesn't tell us where we are going, it just tells us where things are. Astrology doesn't tell us what we're going to do. It just tells us when we're going to get to certain intersections. And if we're at that intersection totally unprepared, we're likely to take the course of least resistance, which may or may not be our best choice. But if we know an intersection is coming up and we're prepared for it, well, then we get to not wait until we're at the intersection and then freak out. Instead, we get to prepare. And when we reach that intersection, we have some idea as to what that intersection is all about and what our choices might be. And that's a much higher use of astrology than simply being obsessed or being afraid of Pluto going over our ascendant or reaching our moon or whatever the aspect might be, or yeah.
As you were speaking, I was thinking we could probably just swap out the word obsession with the word passion, because you're passionate about astrology, you're passionate about music, you're passionate about all these things, and you love them, and it's fun for you to continually explore them.
Yeah, and I think the difference between and I'm not sure what the dictionary, we could check in with Chat GPT, but in my mind, the difference between a passion and an obsession is that there's a fine line between feeling something very strongly and reaching a point where that feeling something very strongly is having negative impact on the rest of your life.
Right. It owns you. It owns you. And I think when we're obsessed with something too, there's this angst or fear of losing it or not having it. And I've seen that before, that astrology can be something that people rely on so much that if it gets taken away from them for some reason, they can't access what they were accessing for information. It's like taking something away from an addict. I mean, it can be that like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to live now?
Yeah.
And I think that's when it sort of goes into that line of, ooh, like, was that a healthy relationship with the thing?
Yeah. I have, when I lived in Minneapolis, I had a friend who was a Methodist minister, and his daughter, I think at the time, was maybe about 10 years old or so. And we would hang out in his living room, a group of us. We got together very often and just had these incredible, deep, conversations about, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, meaning of things, and, what I like to call cosmic bullshit, not making any less of it. It's my life. But one day when we were talking about astrology, and his daughter was often present at these conversations, and I should say she was an amazing athlete, and she played on a boys' little league team, baseball, and she was a shortstop, and she was really good. And she said, and she kind of interrupted the flow, and she goes, I have a problem with this, all this astrology stuff, because because if I'm standing and playing the field, and I'm thinking that this batter is left-handed, the pitcher does this, there's someone on first base, he's going to run to second, I need to make that play to second base first, and if I'm going through all this stuff in my head, I'm so lost in thought that. And then she stops, she goes, but if I'm not thinking anything, and if I'm just there, man, when that ball comes to me, I just automatically know what to do. It was very powerful, because people get lost in the analytical side of astrology when if we cleared our own bullshit, we know what to do. And astrology can be used as a corroboration to what our decisions are. And I think the greatest gift of astrology is it can help people understand that they're really part of the cosmos, that I am not separate from everything that's out there. In fact, we are one and the same. In some way, I'm a reflection of that. However, I don't have to blindly react to everything. I mean, there are things that I can't change, what the Greeks called hemarmene, the fate of, if I fall off a cliff, I will accelerate at the speed of 32 feet per second until I hit the ground and maybe die. I can't control that if I'm falling. But there are things that I can control, like if someone does something or says something to me that's not okay, I can choose to get angry. I can choose to overreact and maybe do something that might be detrimental in the long run. There's many ways in which I can respond. And here's the thing that astrology teaches, as does yoga, as does most forms of spiritual practice and meditation. And that is that there's a difference between reaction and response. And that often we get into trouble when we respond as we react. Now, there's a certain time that we have to do that. Often it's There are times when responding immediately can be life-saving. However, there are times when it's not, and the best thing we can do is simply allow the reaction to occur internally and then respond in some way that makes sense, rather than a reaction like like an infant, will cry and scream as soon as it feels pain or whatever. And as adults, we learn that we can process before we go there. And again, I'm not saying that we should not feel things and not trust what it is we're feeling, but sometimes there's this balance. And I think astrology teaches us that we have that capability to work with these complex energies rather than always feeling like we're at effect. We also have ability or agency to be cause, although we can't do it. The time to figure out how to sail a ship is not when you're on a ship alone in the middle of a storm and your sails have ripped. That's not the time to learn how to take down the sails and put up new ones or whatever. The point is that there are tools and practices that we need to learn along the way, so that we're capable of dealing with a crisis, an emergency, a difficult situation, rather than just feeling overwhelmed by it and then taking the course of least resistance.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that as we engage with astrology, it's important to stay aware of ourselves in it, to not give our power away to it or to any perceived bad transit, or any perceived information, that we don't give away our authority to it and get swept up in the fear of it or the anxiety of it or whatever that might create.
Which sometimes is easier to say than to do. I mean, if your life is on the edge and you don't have money and you've been and you've lost your job and you can't feed your kids and people are suffering too. I mean, it's all fine and dandy for us to say this like this, but it's not always easy to turn it into reality. And so I'm just want to make sure that there's no quick and easy, one size fits all solution to, oh, now I know it's not just me. It's, I can change things. Ram Dass used to say, that, God comes to the homeless in the form of food. It's like we can't deal with thinking about how we're going to make our life better if we have a 500-pound weight on our right foot.
Right. Yes. Yes. And I mean, even with everything that all the astrology I'm around, all the astrologers I get to hear from, I've looked up things like Pluto on your sun. And when you read what they say about it, it's like, it's kind of hard not to be like, ooh, that's kind of scary. That doesn't sound very fun. Like there's that gripping that happens.
Yeah.
So being aware of ourselves and how we're reacting to it.
And one thing about what you just said, Pluto in particular, but the further out the planet, the slower moving it is, the more it requires us to deal with what's going on. If you're sitting having breakfast one day with your spouse or your lover or friend, and you look at them and go, ugh, and you go bury yourself in your cell phone. What an idiot, and you go, I can't believe I'm sitting here with this person. They're disgusting. And then an hour later, you feel great. You were just in a bad mood. That's a bad moon. A bad moon, only lasts for an hour or so, or, bad mood, our emotions change. But if you're in a bad Mars, or worse, a bad Saturn, that feeling stays around long enough that you got to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is that Saturn, as the slowest moving known planet for thousands of years, was the ultimate worst planet, because when it came, it wasn't going to leave until you either cashed in your chips or changed. Then when Uranus was discovered, it was immediately thought to be worse than Saturn. It was destructive. It was cataclysmic. It was awful. It was like lightning striking and burning down your house. And it was only later, as we learned to assimilate it, that we realized it's also breakthrough in genius. And then when Neptune was discovered, and you read books from the late 1800s, early 1900s about Neptune, and all they talk about is delusion and psychosis and schizophrenia and mental institutions, insane asylums. And it was only later that we began to realize if we can assimilate this information and work with it, this is the source of our creative imagination. This is spirituality. This is our connection with everything that's invisible in the three-dimensional world. And the same was true with Pluto. When it was discovered at the time of the rise of mass fascism in the early 30s, you had Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin. I mean, it was awful. And so Pluto was labeled with all this, mass fascism, control, domination. And it was only through time that as we learned to assimilate the hell realms, the lord of the hell realms, or the underworld, the unconscious, by doing shadow work, we learned that the most exquisite transformations that we can process are basically plutonic. And so this whole thing of bad planets, and projection of negativity onto the future is a very dangerous obsession with astrology. And I'm not saying that bad things don't happen or that difficult things don't happen. I'm not saying that there aren't natural disasters that kill thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people in a sweep, or wars that kill millions of people, or horrific genocides, or mass shootings, or whatever. These things are, I'm not trying to Pollyanna anything. I'm simply saying that the events themselves happen. And yes, there are things that we as humans can do to either mitigate or to maybe make those events less prevalent, although we can't control everything externally. And in this day and age, one of the difficult things is that pretty much all of us humans are overwhelmed by the speed of change and by the speed of technology altering our lives in ways that we don't even fully realize yet. And we're overwhelmed by those people who are in control, their inability to deal with it. And so we have a system where we have either religion, churches, or political institutions, or schools, or external systems that we rely on, whether it's the trash pickup or getting electricity through our wall sockets, or whatever it is. We're relying on external things that we don't have control over. And as we see them break down or fall apart, this creates a high level of anxiety or fear, especially when there's such a bifurcation of what is the best course for humanity to take. Is it this road or is it that road? And unfortunately, on 50 different issues, there's different roads to take. And by taking one road, it doesn't mean that we're taking that same road for another decision, which makes us feel as humans overwhelmed, which then drives us to look for answers. And astrology seems to sit in a place where for some people, it has quick and easy answers. You look at a chart, this is good, this is bad, this works, this doesn't work, boom, done. And in a way, it's like the church. The last book that Sigmund Freud wrote was a book called The Future of an Illusion. That was the name of the book, The Future of an Illusion. And it was basically about how he believed that the mother and father that we have as an infant, as we grow up, is projected onto reality and has created throughout time the institutions of the church, the Father in heaven, the mother church, that we gain the same feeling of infantile safety from these external institutions that should protect us like our parents should protect us. And of course, our parents don't always protect us, and neither does the government nor the church. Now, where do we go with this? We come back to astrology. We can have a tool to see things the way they are without imposing, our fear onto it, by looking at what can we do in a situation to either ameliorate the potential difficulty, to work with it, or even to respond to what may come of it, rather than just fearing what it is that's out there.
Okay. Well, I think Kristen Moonrise kind of sums up, I'd say, at least what I'm taking away from the conversation around obsession and how things become obsessed, how we become obsessed and all these things, which is basically know thyself. Know thyself, watch thyself, engage with it. Bear witness to the way that you engage with it and where it feels like it's getting unhealthy, where it feels like it's a helpful tool, where you're falling into patterns, where you're using it in order to not fall into patterns.
And you know who the original people were who had that idea? The Gnostics. The word gnosis, Gnosis, basically gnosis means to know. If you're agnostic, that means you don't know. And in a way, whether we realize it or not, we're all agnostic. We don't know. And anyone who thinks they know may be on a path, but they don't know either. But I really think it's not just about knowing thyself. It's also being in relationships where you don't assume that you know someone else. Big danger of astrologers. I'm looking at your chart. I know you. I don't know you. I know that your Mars is square Saturn, but I don't know whether you're, angry at your dad because he beat up on you as a kid and now you're beating up on other people, or if you're an amazing athlete who has taken that hot cold, start stop energy of the Saturn Mars square and have turned it into something that becomes human excellence. We're about, as astrologers, our job is not to know our client. Our job is to use our tool to empower our clients. And in fact, I see my friend and editor and our associate Gail Goldberg on the line. I'm outing you, Gail, who just posted in the chat, the ethics of astrology are essential to consider. If I am not empowering my client and encouraging their awareness and free will, then I am not doing my job. And I would say I couldn't agree more, but that's stated in the negative. I agree, stated in the positive. That's what our job is. And granted, empowering someone doesn't always give them the answer. You can have a client who's been wrongly convicted of a crime, who's on death row, and you can tell them that they have the power in their life to change their life. But it's like it's harmony. It's like the person who's falling off the cliff and accelerating at the speed of, a free falling object. And that doesn't mean that person should give up. But again, no matter what the difficult situation is, we always have a choice as to how we respond rather than just react. Sometimes it's easier than others. And for some people, it seems to be easier than others always. And for some people, it seems to be easy at some times and impossible at other times. These are all things to be aware of, because it's not one or the other. It's about awareness. Know thyself as best as one can at every given moment.
Yes. And the other takeaway is that it's complex. There's no black or white answer here. There's a lot of things to consider. And again, it comes back to your own barometer of what's a healthy engagement. Because there's people in the chat saying, I'm obsessed and I am obsessed and I love it. And I just can't get enough. And it's like, well, who's to say that that's bad or wrong? That's not.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly correct. And again, I think the danger, or one danger, not the danger, is to label or classify someone else's interest, disinterest, passion, or obsession because we don't know what that person is actually doing with it or how it's impacting them. I would say, though, that when a passion or a belief, and I would say a belief is a step toward a passion. If you believe something really fervently, then that becomes a passion, whether it's I believe in this teaching or whether I believe you're the most awesome person I ever met in my life. Those are both beliefs that can create a passion, but they can create an obsession that will then have us do things that may be harmful to ourselves, but more importantly, they may be harmful to someone else. And when someone has a belief that then imposes their belief on other people's beliefs, that is a warning signal. And that's part of the fear that we all live with in this day and age, because it doesn't matter what side of any coin you come up with, even though I have my very strong beliefs about very many issues. There are many issues where I don't know, but there are many issues that even if I don't know, I think I know. But that I think I know doesn't mean that I get to make you think what I think. And that's the danger. And that's really one of the beginning concepts of this country, the United States of America, that we're not doing a very good job of living up to.
Whew, and that's a whole nother can of worms that we could
Well,
explore.
it's not another can of worms, and I'm not looking at having any of those discussions about any of those issues. I'm just saying that if we can't figure out a way to understand when our beliefs become an obsession that's hurting others, then it doesn't matter what our beliefs are that have become obsessions. No one's going to be happy.
All right, Rick, thank you so much for this meandering but very fulfilling and juicy exploration of this topic of astrology and obsession and how that operates and where's the line and how do we engage with astrology in a way that is empowering? How do we even speak to astrology in a way that empowers others? So many different things covered today.
Well, I think one of the opportunities that we have at this junction is to create new language. And this is happening in astrology. It's not just me. I mean, it really, in some ways, began with the Dane Rudger and the creation of what we now call humanistic and or then evolutionary astrology, where we are less judgmental and predictive and more cooperative and empowering. And I think that change is going on in astrology quite powerfully, whether we're a part of that or not, but maybe not fast enough.
Interesting. Okay, well, thank you for helping us get one step closer to that. And if any of you are listening and you're thinking you want to engage with astrology in a way that is mindful of so many of the things that we talked about here today, check out Rick's Astrology Foundation series that he has taught, because that will give you, even the question I asked, well, how would you talk about that upcoming transit in a way that isn't disempowering, that isn't like using the power of suggestion to bring something about in someone's life that they might not want to experience. And so if you want to learn how to do that yourself, if you want to explore more how Rick approaches a chart and the foundations through which he gets to his conclusions, check out Astrology Foundations. It's a whole series that Rick has taught with us here at Astrology Hub. You can go to astrologyhub.com/foundations, and that's where you can start. And there's a level 1, level 2, level 3. There's also chart reading extravaganzas where he's actually reading charts live. So you can see him in real time and why he's saying certain things the way he's saying them.
Amanda, one thing before we go, and that is words of wisdom that I learned from my now deceased astrology buddy, partner in crime, Jeff Jower. And actually yesterday was his birth anniversary, day before yesterday, his birthday. So he's been on my mind. But Jeff used to say, and I love this, and I've basically have adopted this to be my own, but I got it from Jeff. And I tell almost every client that I see as we get warmed up to go into our session, just for the record, I don't care whether I'm right or wrong. If I'm saying something that doesn't make sense to you or is just plain wrong, say it, share that with me, because I have no skin in the game of wanting to be right. This is not about an ego venture for me. And this was Jeff's line. I'd much rather be useful than be correct.
Mm.
And I think that that's something that so many astrologers look at a chart and they want to say the right things. No, you say the things that the chart is bringing up and that comes up in your interaction with the other person. But and I don't mean you, Amanda, I mean you, Rick, I mean you, any astrologer looking at a chart, you don't have the answers. You just have a map and you're just making shit up. Now, you're making good shit up because you've been trained to know what these archetypes are in general, but you don't know how they work in your client's life. And therefore, it's more important for us to be useful than it is to be right.
I love it, Rick. We have a survey that goes out after all the readings that happen on Astrologer Connect on our reading platform. And I've been amazed at how many people comment about how much they loved that the astrologer checked in with them. The astrologer asked them questions. The astrologer listened, and it wasn't just like this top down, hey, this is what's going to happen. It was
which is very different than the way an astrology reading was 50 or 100 years ago.
So maybe
there was no conversation. It was just, I'm the astrologer, I'm the authority, and I'm telling you what's going on.
Right. Exactly. So maybe things are changing, Rick, which is a good thing.
Good. This has been lovely. Thank you as always.
All right. I'm getting a little interference on my line here. I'm not sure if it's me or you, Rick, but thank you everybody for being here. Thank you so much for all of your chat and your comments. If you love this content, make sure that you subscribe to the channel, share the videos with your friends. And for those of you who do that all the time, thank you. We're so grateful. It helps us get these shows out to more people. So thank you so much for that. And we will catch you on the next episode. Rick, thank you so much for your time. I think that we're having some technical difficulties. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. And thank you, Amanda.